Deep within the forests of the northern wilderness, a legend has persisted for centuries. The Wendigo, a name that echoes through indigenous folklore and colonial accounts alike, conjuring images of a monstrous creature driven by an insatiable hunger. But what if everything you believed about this entity was fundamentally wrong? What if the Wendigo was never truly a monster at all, but rather a haunting warning about the darkest aspects of human nature itself? A story of the Wendigo begins not with a beast, but with a condition. In the harsh winters of the Great Lakes and subarctic regions, survival was never guaranteed. When food became scarce and communities faced the slow, agonizing grip of starvation, something terrible would sometimes emerge. Not a supernatural creature, but a psychological and physical transformation that occurred when hunger consumed a person entirely. The indigenous peoples of the Algonquian nations understood this phenomenon deeply. They had witnessed it, they had lived through it, and they created the legend of the Wendigo to warn future generations about the price of unchecked greed and desperation. Consider the historical context. During the brutal winters that could last 6, 7, or even 8 months, food stores would dwindle. A family might have enough preserved meat to last until spring, or they might not. The difference between survival and death was sometimes measured in single portions. In such circumstances, a terrible calculus would emerge in desperate minds. What if one person ate less so that others could eat more? What if the weakest member of the group was sacrificed for the survival of the strongest? These weren't abstract philosophical questions. These were survival decisions that faced real people in real extremity. The Wendigo legend emerged as a cultural response to cannibalism born of starvation, but the indigenous peoples were far more sophisticated in their understanding than a simple monster story. The Wendigo represented something far more psychological and spiritual. It was the embodiment of a person who had crossed a moral threshold they could never recross, someone who had consumed human flesh, whether by necessity or choice, and in doing so had become something other than human. Not because of a curse or a physical metamorphosis, but because they had surrendered their humanity to their hunger. The descriptions of the Wendigo in historical accounts speak to this internal transformation. A creature that was never satisfied, eternally starving despite consuming everything. A being that walked between worlds, no longer fully part of the human community. The Wendigo in legend is often described as impossibly thin, skeletal, with skin stretched tight over bone. This wasn't the description of a powerful monster. It was the description of starvation itself. It was hunger given form. It was the visual manifestation of what happens when a person allows appetite to consume their entire being. What makes the Wendigo tragedy even more profound is understanding how it served as a social warning. In oral traditions, stories about the Wendigo weren't meant to entertain, they were meant to terrify, and that terror served a purpose. It reinforced cultural values around sharing, cooperation, and restraint. Young people hearing these stories would understand intuitively that greed was dangerous, that hoarding resources could lead not just to social ostracism, but to spiritual corruption. That the moment you began to see your community members as food, rather than family, you had already become the monster. Documented historical cases of Wendigo possession, as the indigenous peoples describe them, reveal patterns that modern psychology might recognize as severe mental illness combined with malnutrition. Historical records describe individuals who became obsessed with eating human flesh, who experienced hallucinations and paranoia, who felt compelled to commit cannibalistic acts despite existing food sources. These weren't necessarily people who had been starving. Some had adequate supplies, yet they felt driven by something beyond their conscious control. The Wendigo legend gave them a framework for understanding psychological breakdown in the context of their spiritual worldview. European colonists and fur traders who encountered these stories often misunderstood them entirely. They interpreted the Wendigo as a literal creature, a genuine monster that stalked the forests. They missed the deeper cultural function of the legend. They couldn't comprehend that indigenous peoples were describing a psychological and spiritual phenomenon through the language of mythology. The Wendigo became sensationalized in colonial accounts, transformed into a bloodthirsty beast that existed outside the moral framework the original legend had constructed. But here's where the real tragedy unfolds. As colonization intensified, the actual conditions that gave birth to Wendigo legends became worse, not better. Indigenous communities were forcibly relocated away from traditional hunting grounds, food stores were disrupted, starvation became not an occasional hardship but a deliberate tool of subjugation. The very conditions that had once threatened communities, conditions that the Wendigo legend warned against, were being systematically imposed by colonial powers. The irony is bitter and almost unbearable. The legend of the Wendigo was created by a people who understood the dangers of unchecked hunger and greed. The legend served to bind communities together through shared values of restraint and cooperation. Yet the very colonial forces that dismissed these legends as primitive superstition were themselves driven by an insatiable hunger for resources and land. The colonists didn't heed the warning. They became the Wendigo. When we look at the Wendigo legend through this lens, we begin to understand its true power. It wasn't a story about a monster that hunted humans in the forest. It was a story about the monster that could emerge from within humanity itself when hunger and greed were left unchecked. It was a cautionary tale about what happens when we stop seeing other people as members of our community and start seeing them as obstacles to our own survival. When we begin to consume not just resources, but each other. The transformation into a Wendigo, in the original indigenous understanding, wasn't instantaneous. It was gradual. It began with small moral compromises, a little extra food taken when others were hungry, a slight favoritism toward one's own family at the expense of the community. These small choices accumulated. Each compromise made the next one easier, until finally the threshold was crossed. The person had become something other than what they were, not because of magic, but because of the choices they had made. This understanding of the Wendigo speaks to something profoundly human. We all contain within us the capacity for selfishness and cruelty. We all face moments where hunger, whether literal or metaphorical, might tempt us to compromise our values. The Wendigo legend was a reminder that these moments matter, that the choices we make when we're desperate shape who we become, that there are thresholds we cross, and once crossed, we can never fully return. The untold tragedy of the Wendigo, then, is not the tragedy of a monster. It's the tragedy of a people who created a profound cautionary legend, only to find themselves subjected to conditions that would create actual monsters. It's the tragedy of wisdom being dismissed as superstition. It's the tragedy of a warning going unheeded. And it's the tragedy of understanding, perhaps too late, that the real danger was never in the forests or the shadows. It was always within ourselves, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. The Wendigo, in the end, serves as a mirror, and what we see reflected in that mirror is ourselves.